We talked last week about the Vestal Virgins in Rome, about tending the sacred fire, and about how the Vestal Virgins really continued in Rome a tradition that was very ancient, went back countless centuries before Rome was founded. Rome was founded in the 750s BC. Let's think to ourselves. Let's try and bring ourselves present here. I know that there are distractions and that the distractions continue. The distractions of life are incessant. They must be made a background pattern, a white sound. Otherwise, nothing can be known. Let's just bring ourselves present here. Let's forget about all of the technical glitches. Let's forget about other subjects. Let's forget about modes of ourself that distract us from the present moment. I'm really here, and if you're really here, we'll make a contact. And in that contact, what can flow is something deeper than language. I'm going to sing for you. I'm going to use a kind of a language which is like a song. You don't have to be able to hear everything in this language. You will feel the song, and the song having been felt, your own juices will begin to flow, and within you will come images that are true. This is the whole nature of myth. Mythic language is a flow. It's a telling. It's a saying. It's a storyteller. Let me tell you this story. There's a kind of a quality of comfort and security. There's a hominess. There's a tribal veracity. There's a gathered humanity quality to the storytelling. Let me tell you this story. The story is the lecture for today. Its myth, its mythos, is the ongoingness. We talked last week about the Vestal Virgins. We talked about the sacred fire. We talked about how it was tended by women, and that this sacred fire had been tended by women since time immemorial. When King Numa Pompilius in 715 BC instituted the Vestal Virgins protecting the hearth fire, the central symbol of a home, a place that one could get to, a nourishment that one could be in. It was already millennia old. And we talked about how for over 1100 years, the Vestal Virgins in Rome, in the city, tended this fire, the sacred temple of Vesta, which is the Roman pronunciation of Hestia, goddess of the hearth. And how masculine authority in the personage of Pope Theodosius in 394 AD put the fire out, dispersed the Vestal Virgins. In the late 300s, all of this kind of action was taken because of a Roman masculine authority that had reestablished an empire in the name of Christianity. There was nothing charitable about it. There was nothing hopeful about it. There was nothing beautiful about it. If you did not believe in the religion of the state, you were killed. You were put aside. and all of the ancient, truthful ways of the heart were stamped out. Eventually, even Plato's Academy in Athens, whose doors had been open for almost 1,000 years, were closed. Were closed because there were no more students. An age much like the end of the age that we live in now, where real wisdom is actually offered, and so few people are there to hear it that it's almost like a gathering for a card game rather than some kind of passing on of the energies of civilization. It winds down to that. In that time period, all of the wisdom that man had lived by in a continuous way and had delivered continuously through myth had to be protected. One could no longer speak about it. One could no longer say it. And so that tradition had to be interiorized. It had to be taken out of the language and put in symbols. It had to be taken out of the exterior world and put hidden in an interior world. Make no mistake about this, that wisdom always wins. There is no amount of worldly power that has any effect whatsoever, because the world cannot give life or light. Worldly power can only give dictates, enforce a patois of legalisms, and delude the population with clevernesses and half-offerings. One of the most enduring symbols from the time period of the closing down of the exterior wisdom traditions, the muffling of the sacred mythic tradition, was the development of symbols which carried the direct opposite, that is to say, the world quality had to be made in an opposite way in the symbols. Where something in the world had been carried by women, in the symbols it had to be carried by a man. The community of women in the external world is directly opposite an interior man, symbolically. Let's go over it again so we don't make any mistake. We're not talking about anything that is complicated. Inside, one man image. Outside, many women. Many women directly opposite to one man. So that the interior, symbolic image that carried the sacred fire was now a single man, not a number of men. And it was a sacred man in the sense that he cut himself off from the world. And because of the time, because of the early 500s in which this image became cinched, it became bound together, it became imprinted in the wisdom tradition as a psychic symbol. The symbol became that of the wandering hermit who carried the sacred fire in his portable lantern. There was no longer any possibility of having the sacred fire in some architectural place. Those fires had been stamped out, so it had to be a portable fire. The lantern. The lantern is the portable fire. And so the single hermit man carrying the lantern became the symbol in the early 500s AD of the way in which sacredness, the sacredness which could, as a pilot light, relight civilization, was taken. And in the Greco-Roman world, or we should say it the way it was, in the Christian Roman Empire world, which had taken over and dominated The last great generation of capable individuals was around 500 AD. And you had, as you do in any death throe, you had a final fluorescence of genius. 3 individuals characterized the genius of that time. Boethius, who wrote the last book of ancient philosophy, and it became the first real book of medieval philosophy, called The Consolation of Philosophy. It was Chaucer's favorite book. Chaucer, who lived almost 1,000 years later. The consolation of philosophy, that when they take away everything from you, you can still have your private thoughts, at least as long as you are an educated person, but someone uneducated no longer even has the privilege of private thoughts. Someone uneducated takes whatever is given to them, and they think that's mind. They think that's an interior life. There's no structure. There's no way to accept the absorption to the point where interior symbols come alive. And so to someone who has no structured capacity of mind, this is a card in a game, and not a symbolic image that has significance about the pilot light of starting civilization again. The very word hermit, the hermit, comes from the term which we apply to the tradition, the Hermetic tradition. Hermits are hermetic knights. They're knights who have to endure a quest of carrying the pilot lights of civilization around individually for an undetermined time. How long? Until you are relieved of your duty. How long is that? Until the civilization is lit again and works again. And then you can put your light down, because there will be places where you can place it and it will be kept sacred again. There will be places of Hestia again. There will be communities of sacred women again who will respect wisdom as an essential part of life. For without an interior space to collect value, all of the exterior actions become more and more rote, mechanical, based on the pecking order of authorities, decided by councils, and usually they're councils of men. And usually they're councils of men who have been ground down by the battles of cleverness and power. Just like in our present age. And instruction, the proliferation of instruction, obscures like a wonderful veil, a wonderfully effective veil, almost like a demonic veil, that ocean of instruction everywhere, but no wisdom. Water, water everywhere, not a drop to drink. Instruction, instruction everywhere, but not any wisdom at all. For wisdom always is distinguished from instruction. Wisdom always is someone lights your pilot light inside, and you use that to begin to see in terms of structure. So that a living myth, a living mythic tradition, always nourishes the interiorization of the language, nourishes the appearance, the natural occurrence of the symbol. When there is no interior space where natural symbols can occur spontaneously, then we are queued up like slaves of the state, waiting to be told what to do. And of course, there are always those who are ready to tell us what to do. and exactly. In the 500s, early 500s, Boethius, who wrote the Consolation of Philosophy, was joined by Dionysius the Areopagite, whose great mystical treatises on the celestial and the mystic orders of reality, on the symbolic significance of divine names. And those two, Boethius and Dionysius the Areopagite, were joined by the last great Platonic philosopher, Proclus, the last Neoplatonic genius to understand exactly what the symbolic depths of Plato and Plotinus and that whole tradition had gone on for 1,000 years. And when that generation died out in the 520s AD, it was like lights being turned off and houses being abandoned, and a darkened landscape occupied Europe. And this darkened landscape was not lit again for hundreds of years. Hundreds of years. It was exactly when those lights were going off in Italy, in Rome, in Greece, that you had a single campfire lit on the very edge of what had been the Roman Empire. In fact, just beyond the edge of what had been the Roman Empire. Exactly on the other side of the last fence, the last farthest fence of the Roman Empire, a single light went on. It was in an area known today as Scotland. The Romans, who were incorporating Britannium as a Roman province due to the military acumen of Julius Caesar, and for almost 200 years the Roman legions pushed and tried to extend their power, and they could push no farther than a certain narrowed part of the northern part of the British Isle. And they built a wall there called Hadrian's Wall. That was as far as they could push Roman power. And on the other side of it were the barbarians, the Picts, the Scots, who were never included in the Roman Empire. They were never ground up by Roman authority. And when the lights went out in the Roman Empire, a single light went on across the wall on the other side of Hadrian's Wall, in what is today southern Scotland. And that light was the pilot light carried by a single hermit. One man carried his lantern there and lit it, and from that light came all of the Arthurian myths, all of the Arthurian mythological cycle, which preserved all of the ancient wisdom symbols. And the central symbol that was in that light, it should be here in this tarot card, but unfortunately the Victorian English who made this tarot card put instead a 6-pointed star instead of a 5-pointed star. They put what they call the Star of David in here, thinking that it was Jewish, and this is very ancient, and well, it's Kabbalistic, and well, isn't that what all this is about? And aren't tarot cards Jewish anyway? Aren't they Kabbalistic anyway? And the answer is no, they are not. That they are archetypally Egyptian and have an Egyptian symbolism that was there 1,000 years before Abraham was even born. Older than the Jewish tradition is the Egyptian symbolic tradition, which is the Hermetic tradition. Now, if you get interested in why this should be so, why the Victorian English should be so, in this book, The Messianic Idea in Judaism and Other Essays in Jewish Spirituality, Gershom Scholem, you will find a nice little article on the Star of David, History of a Symbol, starting at page 255. And you will read that the first time that it was ever used, really, was around 1300, 1350, around that time period. But it wasn't until the 1500s that it became something that was used esoterically here and there in Kabbalistic lore. And yes, there is a shield of David in a 3rd century catacomb, and right next to it is a swastika. And if you're going to say that the Star of David is an ancient Jewish symbol, well, you could just as easily say the swastika is too. But neither are. The whole point is that the symbol that was carried was the 5-pointed star, which happens to be the central synthesizing symbol of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is written about the time when the Kabbalistic Shield of David was being used as a kind of a repeat for what was found here in the Hermetic tradition in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Because by the middle of the 1300s, in the Midlands of England, they were remembering the light that had been lit in the Arthurian Mythos in Lower Scotland, which was only about 100 miles from where Sir Gawain and the Green Knight was composed, about 800 years after. And by pairing it in our education here, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, with the book of Daniel, we bring in the Jewish tradition in such a way as to allow us to see what really was esoterically and arcanely related to it. Why should the shield, the Star of David, known esoterically not for David but for Solomon, Solomon, who is the ancient image of wisdom, not David. David was the passion of life. He was the flame of integrity, the man who could dance before God with all his might. But he was not wise in the sense that Solomon was wise. And the epitome of the wise man in Hellenistic Judaism was always Solomon. That's why when you look at apocryphal literature, there are all kinds of books about Solomon. They are not about David. The earliest powerful images of esoteric Hellenistic Jesus symbolism of Jesus from the Jewish integration comes in the Odes of Solomon, written by living people who had experienced Jesus as a Jew, as a Hellenistic Jew, before there was a Christianity. And in the Odes of Solomon, one sees, in the middle of the 1st century A.D., the tremendous realization that Jesus was a teacher in the Hermetic tradition, that Hellenistic Judaism had become a flower in that Hermetic tradition. Just like Abraham became Abraham because he had had the courage to endure the quest to Egypt. Because only by encountering the fearful father which Egypt always presented to the Jewish psyche, Egypt was always the fearful father, the dominating father. Whereas the original matrix out of which they had come, ancient Iran, Persia, was always the comforting mother. and what made the Jewish tradition from Abraham on a particularly strong integrative mode was that it included both the comforting mother and the authoritative domineering father. And that by bringing these two opposite energies together, the only way that they could be kept together is in terms of a dynamic. Because when you let that rest, it rests into a do-or-die polarity. The dominating father and the comforting mother in a static mode spell the end of the line. Only by bringing them together in a dynamic juxtaposition is there any chance whatsoever to bring them together, and one has to keep it dynamic in order to have it together. And in a very real way, the very meter of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is the proof. The very structure of the meter is the proof that it's in the Hermetic tradition, that its pilot light was from Hellenistic Judaism, but a Hellenistic Judaism which was Egyptian in tone and not at all medieval and Kabbalistic. There's nothing Kabbalistic about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. There's nothing medieval about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It is one of the first Renaissance works. Renaissance in the sense that living people at that time remembered what the ancient wisdom was all about and lived it as well as expressed it accurately. One of the women who made an edition of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Marie Boroff, when she published her beautiful study by Yale, hundreds and hundreds of pages, analyzing the alliterative pacing, the syllabic organization. How would something like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight be read out loud? How would this myth, this epic in a mythic mode, be told? And that one of the peculiarities of ancient wisdom literature was always that every line had two parts. Or sometimes, as in Hebrew wisdom poetry, the second part was extended to be a second line, so that whatever the first line was, the second line modified it in some way. Was a parallel with it? Was a polarity against it? Was some kind of a development of reverberation modifying it? But the archetype was always that every line, and the line is what one can say in a single breath. The line was the breath. Say it again so we can get it down and just hear it. You can only say so many words with a single breath. And if you're going to say something that requires a lot of lines, a lot of breaths, and you're going about it in a wisdom way, you pace your breathing. You pace your lines. So that's why there's such a thing as poetry. Poetry is the paced breath of unified speaking. And the classic unifier was that the first half of the line was always balanced with the second half of the line. If you have one syllable in the first half of the line, you have one in the second. And usually because you can't say too much with just a syllable here and a syllable there, the minimum archetype was 2 syllables in the first half of the line, 2 syllables in the second half of the line, so that a line had 4 syllables, 4 stresses, and 4 consonants that weren't stressed, so that you had a kind of a sinuous energy, so that the expressive breathing voice measured itself by a pair of pairs, a 4-part line upon line upon line, so that one got into the mythic rhythm, the cadence of an important story told right. What's important about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is that there is no doubt upon final conclusive scansion that Sir Gawain and the Green Knight preserves all the way through exactly the balanced 4-stress line, 2 and 2. But what is mysterious and peculiar is that every single line in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight tends, upon hearing, to have 5 beats. That somehow the first half of the line almost always, if you really listen closely, has 3 beats, and the second 2. So there's an odd kind of a dynamic skew in the sensibility and the feeling, whereas when the mind analyzes it, you can see that it's perfectly balanced. That is to say, the breathing cadence of the myth of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is delivered in an exactly equilibrium way. But the human feeling experience, the more you know about the significance of the story, the more that the symbolic aspect comes through, the more you hear it as a 5-beat line. Yes, it is only a 4-beat line, but increasingly you hear it as if it were a 5-beat line. And the 5-beat line is the metrical resonance of the symbol of the Hermetic star, which is the livery, as they used to say in chivalry, of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. His shield had this emblem in just these colors. His horse, Gringolet, had this color draped over him with the Hermetic star where the stirrups would be. And Gawain himself is identified by this particular pennant. When knights would go to tournaments, they would have their pennant hung. When they would be at home in their castle, they would hang their flag. Whenever they went into battle, the first thing that they would show is that this is nothing personal. It is not me as just some man, Joe Gawain, fighting, but it is Sir Gawain. And so one would show one symbol. Everything that this symbol is brought into play. And so this action is archetypal and not just individual. It is symbolic and not just some small personal scrabble. So when Marie Boroff gives a symbol on the cover, on the book's cover, she puts a dynamic star. That the way to hear Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is to know enough about the significance of it so that you hear 5 beats to the line. If you only hear 4 beats to the line, then you're just hearing the story on an instructional level. Then you're just an undergraduate taking an English course in the 20th century. But the more that you hear the dynamic of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the more you become a participant in the wisdom tradition of thousands of years. And the more you understand what it was like to hear it pristinely in the time of Chaucer, when it was the first time of rediscovering this is how the ancients spoke when they spoke absolute truth to each other. And they gave myths that in a dynamic mode became symbolic epics. And so Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is very much a myth to the initial pedestrian ear, and very much a symbolic quest in terms of the informed ear. Now, what's extremely difficult to understand, because no one is educated anymore. The professors are not educated, so how can the students be? That there is a direct relationship between the great Middle English of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and the Old English of another epic. The language of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is the language of Chaucer, is called Middle English. Middle English. Ours is Modern English. That's Middle English. Well, is there? Yes, there is. There's an Old English. And the Old English has, oddly enough, peculiarly enough, a fantastically great epic at its very origin. The first time Old English is used in any extensive way, it comes in full blast and a complete mature epic. Is absolute mystery. It's just like Greek comes in with Homer full grown. There's no baby talk in Homer. It's not for first graders. No. The Iliad, which begins Greek literature, begins on the grandest scale imaginable. It's just like the pyramid text of Egypt. The pyramid texts, when they first appear, the Pyramid of Unas is the very first place that a complex of symbolic hieroglyphs is presented, and at that very first instance, the entire symbolic pattern is completely integrated. Egyptian hieroglyphic language begins with a completed epic. Greek begins with a completed epic, and English as a wisdom language begins with the completed epic Beowolf. It's written, it's composed about 700 AD. And when you try to imagine the state of society in England in 700 AD, we think of the worst primitive conditions possible. But wait a minute. Somebody turned on a hermetic pilot light in southern Scotland in the early 500s AD. And so, does it come any surprise that about 200 years later, that there is a full-blown wisdom epic founding the language, that the English language is founded just like Egyptian hieroglyphs, just like classic Greek, it's founded by a great epic. When one goes to India, you don't find Sanskrit starting with little stupid exercises trying to build up from gu gu da da. You find the Rig Veda. Sanskrit is founded as a wisdom language by its great epic, and so it is with every instance of wisdom traditions. The language of the people is founded not on instructional bases, but upon the basis of delivering the complete pattern of wisdom. So that the language is made to convey the completed pattern of wisdom. And anyone who learns that language can be instructed to the point of transmutation to where they begin to get significance, and when they get significance enough, they will forget the instruction and they will hear, like the dynamic 5-part stressed line of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, they will begin to hear the true structure that's there symbolically. When you stop looking at the bricks of a wall and thinking wall, and you start seeing that there is a wonderment, why is there a wall here? What's on the other side? Who put this wall here? Why are there walls? What's inside of it that is different from outside of it? When you begin to look at something in terms of its place in a larger pattern of significance, you stop being led by the nose and you start leading yourselves by your mind. You stop being a cow in someone else's pasture and you start to be a shepherd in your own life. That's called salvation. It has nothing to do with queuing up to the next guru, no matter how famous, no matter how brilliantly clever, it has nothing to do with that. If you will not teach yourself, your soul will languish. All it needs is to have its pilot light lit. But when it's been out forever, the only way to get it lit is through a patient education that brings that space back into maturity. And it takes a lot of dedication, waiting long nights in a dark forest, trying to strike those rocks together to get one single spark that will catch on the tinder that you've prepared. Lighting your soul is just as difficult as lighting a fire in the mountains without a match. You have to prepare a tinder interface to catch that spark, to accept its ignition. And you have to patiently learn how to strike the right kinds of rocks. If it's granite, you're never going to get a spark that really lights tinder. You have to know that it takes flint. Now you can be taught those kinds of things, but you yourself have to make that fire. And those that teach you to respect their expertise are keeping you in their flock. You're a cow in their pasture, not a shepherd in your own right. And there's no sense in saying anything more. The last word in that scenario is moo. Let's take a break. Okay. The reason for showing these two together is so that everyone can see that there's an enormous difference between Celtic symbols and a Hermetic symbol from ancient Egypt. The one has spiky angles, characteristic of a specific kind of geometry, whereas the whorls and spirals of Celtic art are quite different. One of the most peculiar qualities of the Arthurian myths is that they carry an emotional tone of Celtic qualities, but a symbolic structure of Egyptian Hermetic symbols. And that only when one has interiorized the Arthurian myths enough to a deeper level, a deeper coherence, does the Hermetic symbolism come through. It tends, like all great disguised wisdom, not to be there for those who are not sensitive to it. In other words, the Romans were not the first people to establish the fact that power rules over the meek, that worldly authority and power think that they lord it over those who are quietly striving to lead a wisdom life. That in fact it's a characteristic, and thus wisdom traditions are usually disguised and are very good at disguises. And their characteristic disguise is to speak in such a way that the profane will not hear anything. They don't hear anything. The profane being not those who are baddies, but those who have not interiorized enough to have a mind space to allow for structure to be lit up by your own personal pilot light, so that they hear nothing. Case in point, you take a cassette from any lecture here, and play it for friends, and most of them will hear nothing. They don't hear it. Some will hear and will say, what a richness. They have their pilot light lit. They're shepherding their own lives already. And so they have a mental space for this to come into focus. It's not that this is intellectual so much. That's a gross misnomer, and in fact, it's a part of the disguise. Something that occurs in the mind is not intellectualist. It's that it's interior. Do you think that human beings do not have interiors? Language itself can only work if there is an interior. The difference between a human being who is 2 years old and a chimpanzee which is 2 years old is the interior, made by language. The whole purpose of language is to make an interior space. And the whole purpose of a wisdom tradition is to take the language and to show that the language becomes like a second nature. Whereas the first nature was humanized because it was selected by what we do. Ritual is the selection of actions that we do out of the unlimited actions that there are available in nature. Symbols are the selection of the language possibilities. And so symbol and ritual are both selective and objective out of the base of nature and myth. Nature selected makes the ritual structure that makes tribes and cultures and human life possible in the collective. Whereas language is the basis, like nature was, for the collective, language is the basis for the individual, for the symbolic, for the interior. And it is tailor-made to work with the first, so that the cycle of nature is also the cycle of language. They're like two great wheels. Ritual followed nature, so that the ritual year was the epitome of the natural cycle. And the mythic cycle is very much then taking that ritual cycle and opening back out again, so that myth becomes like a second nature. The mythology becomes like a second nature. So that ritual, its selective, limited action cycle, is excerpted from nature and then re-normalized, to use a physics term, as myth. So that ritual and myth go together. They form a kind of a second nature. So you have ritual is like this wheel that's very objective, very shaped, limited, delimited is the correct word. We only do these actions in this sequence at this time, and then we do only these actions in this sequence at this time, and so on. So that the line of development curves round and the ritual year is seen to be circular. So that the circle of ritual emerges out of the ocean of nature. And if you made a painterly image of it, you would have this multicolored ocean, and then you would have a circle, a rainbow circle that comes out, or you could even just paint a rainbow circle on top of the iridescent ocean of nature. In fact, a circular rainbow would be the perfect symbol for the way in which ritual works vis-a-vis nature. The archetypal symbol in China was called the bee. It's usually spelled in English P-I, but it's pronounced in Chinese B. And it was a circle of jade with a hole, a rather large hole in the center. It was the symbol that this is how human life, when it's integral, works. Works vis-a-vis the unlimited possibilities of nature, selected and brought into a limitation so that it will work for us. Because we can't live very easily in an unlimitedness. We have to have some kind of shape. And so the shape of lives is given by the ritual. That's the shape of our lives. But it's the shape of our cultural life. The shape of the interior life has to come from that same process. But that same process now directed not to nature, but to language. There has to be a selection of language. And the forms that come out of the selecting of language are the forms that sustain the interior world, just as the exterior cultural world is sustained by ritual. And those two have to jibe. They have to go together. If they don't, you get an interior world that becomes more and more dissociated from the cultural world. Called in the 19th century alienation. Hegel and Kierkegaard and even poor old Karl Marx wrote a lot about alienation. When the cultural world does not have very much relationship to the interior world, or the interiorization has become radically different from the way in which the culture works. And it was conspicuous with people like Hegel and Kierkegaard because they had evolved a language which was extremely refined. And so the interiorization of that language was extremely refined and quickly outstripped the capacity for it to fit into the culture of the day. While people were still in the culture men were wearing powdered wigs, that interior language of Hegel was talking about transcendental realities, like the mind, which doesn't fit in with powdered wigs at all. And so you had the first modern experience of alienation. That same alienation happened. That exact same alienation happened also in the 14th century. Because at the same time that you had the tremendous developments of the anonymous authors Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, of Chaucer, of John Gower. Notice all these examples are from English language, because it was in the English language that it happened in the 14th century more than any other language. It happened somewhat in French, though it happened in Belgium and the Netherlands more than in France, but pristinely it happened in the English language. And so at the same time that you have great symbolic literature, like Chaucer or Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, you have also fantastic philosophic development. Whether it's in a humane essay form like The Cloud of Unknowing, or another work by that same anonymous author, The Pursuit of Wisdom, or The Letter of Private Direction. You also had it in a philosopher like William of Ockham, whose developments in logic and logical theory were extremely powerful and changed the entire way in which an interiorization of a symbolic structure could be understood. Once some thinker in the 14th century learned to use Occam's razor, he could see that the cultural dictates were full of flaws and inconsistencies, and that one could not really live by them at all. it led to an impasse. And that what happened in the 14th century, very much like what happened in the early 1800s, in the early 19th century in the German language, so that the early 19th century with the German language, the early 14th century with the English language, also happened with Greek in the early 1st century AD, 1st century BC, both. That Greek language in that time changed, especially in the 1st century of the Common Era, 1st century AD. There is a marked change, so that there's such a thing, it's called, for convenience, because it was first noticed by biblical scholars, it's called New Testament Greek. New Testament Greek has peculiar qualities that are not there except in nascent seed in classical Greek. When you read something like the Gospel of St. John, its Greek reads strangely different from something like Aristotle. What's different is that whereas in Aristotle you have clearly edged forms of exposition called rhetorical laws and so forth, in the Gospel of St. John in New Testament Greek, you have all kinds of iridescent possibilities that you yourself, as a hearer, as a reader, have to decide what's being said. There are so many levels of metaphor possible that one literally is restored back to an ocean of possibility again. A second nature established by the language, which has gone into producing an interior that is no longer just a kind of an objective space, like a nice little building block, but is an objective space that's iridescent with unlimited possibilities. And the only way to deal with it is in a dynamic aspect. One has to be really with it, otherwise you experience it as a whole, and you will fall into that hole, and that's what was called the abyss. As long as you keep your wings of your soul, you can fly in that interior space that has suddenly opened up. But if you lose your wings, if you allow them out there to clip your wings, you will not be able to fly in your interior space, and you will then fall into your own abyss. And so that salvation and damnation were of the same place. Heaven and hell were the same place. It just depended on whether or not your soul had wings so that you could fly, then you were in heaven. And if you didn't have wings and couldn't fly, you fell into hell. And so people without courage didn't want to go into the interior world at all because they weren't quite sure if they have wings or not. And to play it safe, we better do what they tell us. And that's how tyrannies are built into empires, by people not having the courage to go within because they don't know whether they have wings or not. And good thing, because most of them don't. Because it takes an education to grow those wings. And when you've grown wings, the interior person looks exactly what the symbolic image of an angel looks like. But everyone can tell you, in 1st century AD, there are only angels in heaven. What makes it hell for the devils is that their wings are not enough to fly, they fall. The devil is a fallen angel, lost his wings. It is so simple and yet so profound, and it's all tied up with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in the book of Daniel. Everything that we need to know about talking about all these mysteries is wrapped up in these two. If one looks at the Arthurian Mythos, you're looking at the Arthurian myths, who date themselves to the early 500s. The Battle of Mount Badon, where Arthur is critically wounded, is 520, 522 AD. So we're talking about the early 500s in southern Scotland. But when those stories were written 1,000 years later, the setting is not in southern Scotland. The setting is in southern England, especially down around Cornwall. Somerset, the Wiltshire Plain. Why, 1,000 years later, are the Arthurian stories transposed to southern England? In fact, the very center of those Arthurian myths is all around Glastonbury, a very conspicuous mound on the top of which was built a very powerful church in Gothic times on the very site of an ancient, the most ancient of all of the high medieval places of pilgrimage. Why? What was there? What was there was the symbolic pilot light of all of the symbolic significance of the Arthurian ethos, all of it. Because what was there on Glastonbury Hill, on the Tor, there's still a ruin of the church left. It looks like a tower. It looks like Coit Tower in San Francisco from a distance. Single, solitary exclamation mark saying, something is here that always is here and never leaves here, no matter what kind of destruction there is. The tower on Glastonbury Tor is built on the spot where Joseph of Arimathea brought the living remains of Jesus to England, to the edge of the Roman Empire, to save it from desecration. So one has to ask, well, who is Joseph of Arimathea? Well, he's not only a figure in Arthurian mythos, but he's a figure in the New Testament. Joseph of Arimathea, as a matter of fact, was very prominent in the city of Jerusalem. He was a member of the Sanhedrin, of the ruling council of the whole city. And when Jesus was crucified, his body was put into a rock tomb. The tomb was the property of Joseph of Arimathea. And when the resurrection is said to have happened, it happened out of Joseph of Arimathea's rock tomb. It was his tomb. Well, what's Arimathea? Joseph of Arimathea. It's some kind of a district, right? Some kind of a place, a village. In fact, it was an area just outside of the bounds of the Hellenistic city of Jerusalem, which was quite large, incidentally, northwest out of it. And its ancient name, 1,000 years before Jesus, its name was Ramah. Ramah. And it was a consecrated city. It was a consecrated village. A little tiny place that had a huge symbolic place because it was the birthplace of Samuel, of the prophet Samuel, for whom 2 books in the Old Testament are written, 1st and 2nd Samuel. And well, who was Samuel? Samuel, because his mother experienced a peculiar blessedness that she would have a child. In her circumstance, at her age, and because of certain prayer, she dedicated the son in her womb to the service of God before he was born. And so Samuel was the very first. The Hebrew word for that was Nazarite. The very first to be completely dedicated before birth to God. And Samuel is the maker of Jewish kings. It is Samuel who gives the kingship, gives it to Saul, and when Saul turns out to be a bad egg, he takes it back and takes it away and gives it to David. The maker of kings is a sacred figure who has as a shape for his interiority a consecration to God before he is born. Before there's any acculturation whatsoever, he's already affine to God. And just as Samuel makes David king, Merlin makes Arthur king in just exactly the same way. Not at birth, but because of special deeds, special symbolic deeds. That Merlin takes the kingship away from someone that he had made king already and gives that kingship to a young man who had done something very special and showed that he indeed was worthy of being the right king. And so King Arthur, in the Arthurian mythos, has a direct resonance to David in the Hebrew ethos. They're very, very similar. But when David died, there was a son like Solomon who was wise, who becomes the symbol of wisdom and the kingship coming together. But Arthur dies and there is no successor, there's no son. And so one has in the Arthurian ethos the expectation that Arthur will come again and be a Solomon-like figure. He will be a wise king. Except that in that tradition it's informed by a Christianity which had Jesus as the wise king. The resurrected Jesus, the one who'd come out of the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, who took the living body of Jesus' essence to Glastonbury and put it there as the pilot light. And so the Arthurian mythos has a whole interesting kind of intricacy, a cosmology that the future Arthur will be a second coming of the wise king, almost like a resurrection. Now what's poignant about this and peculiar about this is that the entire Arthurian mythos emphasizes that Arthur himself, because of the confines of his tasks, because of the special nature of his kingship, he is not the one who can defend it. It has to be defended by someone else, by one of his knights. Arthur cannot be the chivalric hero for Guinevere. Lancelot must be the defender of the queen. And in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Arthur cannot fight the Green Knight. Someone must volunteer to do that. Gawain volunteers to do that. In a way, there's this sense of substitution by necessity of form. And instead of substitution, we have to understand here that there's something where there's an exchange. Malinowski's idea in his cultural anthropology of reciprocity is extremely important. The way that the Tao works is that yin and yang are reciprocal. They always are willing to exchange with each other, and that's why there's a dynamic called Tao. If yin and yang were not reciprocal, there would be no Tao. If there's no dynamic, the interiority is static, and not only does it cease to be Tao, but it becomes a neutered nothing. So it's only because of the reciprocity, of the exchange capacity, that anything real happens. I have some notes here that stress this. When we begin Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, it doesn't take long, about 30 lines, before we're told that if we will only listen to this story, we will hear something wondrous, and that this story is being given to us by someone who heard it in town himself. So this is a mythic ongoing linearity. If we will listen to someone who's telling this, they will tell us what they themselves heard. So that in between two ears is one mouth. We provide one ear, just as the author who's telling us had listened with his ears. And so the mythic horizon has its linearity by the fact that ears are aligned. When ears are aligned, then the sound passes from ear to ear to ear all the way through. That the audio canals of each ear line up and they make a tunnel of hearing, of accuracy. And that's why the Buddha's sutras always begin with the phrase, "Thus have I heard." Always. There's not one single sutra out of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds that does not begin with, "Thus have I heard." It is the Buddha who spoke, and whoever heard that is speaking to us. So that one understands that this sutra, the very word sutra in Sanskrit means thread. This thread of hearing is pure. It's pure. You're not reading down a static thing, like a page, which gets in the way of the continuity of the hearing tradition. If you hear this right, because it will be told right, because the teller has heard it right themselves, the tunnel of hearing will be straight through. The inner ear canal, your inner ear canal, will join the inner ear canal of this pure tradition. You will hear it exactly the way everyone who has been able to live a life in this tradition has heard it. There'll be no impairment whatsoever. Now, the magical thing about this is that even after 1,000 years of no one hearing it right, when someone speaks it right, it commences the hearing exactly where it left off. That time makes no difference. There is no hiatus. This world's vicissitudes have no effect whatsoever on the continuity of the inner hearing. If someone can speak the wisdom language the right way, wherever they speak it, the hearing is continued unbroken. Now, one of the figures who knew about storytelling was J.R.R. Tolkien, and it's his edition of Sir Gawain and the Green Knights that's the great edition. He knew a lot about storytelling. He told wonderful stories. I'm sure you've read The Hobbit and maybe Lord of the Rings. Tolkien is the one who makes us aware that Sir Gawain and the Green Knight bears a very special resemblance, in symbolic ways, to Beowolf. Even though there's 650 years between them. Tolkien says, he has a little essay called Beowulf and the Monsters. He says something like this. It's quoted by a man named J.A. Burrow. a reading of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is one of the really wonderful little commentaries. There are a lot of commentarial literature on Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. He quotes Tolkien. The Beowulf poet had, of course, to say one thing after another, linearity, like everyone else. But he tells his stories out of the natural order, so that Beowulf, which like any story has to be told one thing after another, but in Beowulf, the selection of what the things are is flashbacks very often and flash forwards, so that the linearity is completely broken up with flashbacks and flash forwards, so that the longer one reads Beowulf, the more one comes to understand that this is a line which is glimmering in a kind of an ordinal jewel-like way. That the structure of Beowulf is a line, a mythic story line, which becomes so perforated by past and future as to become a present gem. Now, someone who cannot hear the gem-like structure of that experiences it as static. In 700 AD, most people who would hear Beowulf couldn't hear a thing, not one blessed thing. Or on the other hand, not one damn thing. They heard stasis, static. It doesn't make sense. You're supposed to be telling us an Arnold Schwarzenegger story, and instead you're bringing in Ingmar Bergman themes all the time. Well, this is nothing, right? One is canceling out the other. It's like mixing the Prince of Conan the Barbarian with Wild Strawberries. Every other frame. Well, you don't get either, right? And the peculiarity about Beowulf is that it is a rousing epic of a hero kicking hell out of a monster, a hell fiend. But mixed in with it, not mixed, woven in with it, in high art, are all of the interior values that were identified as mystically Christian at the time. Not church Christian, mystically Christian, which really are Hellenistic Judaism. And the author of Beowulf, who I think was the very great Venerable Bede, who wrote a history of the English church and people, was the only man alive at the time who could have written Beowulf. Took two incommensurates. Swashbuckling, you get the Freudian slip? Swashbuckling. Yeah. That's why Harpo Marx never spoke. He would come out with Joyceisms all the time, right? A swashbuckling wisdom story. And the more that one reads Beowulf, the more you see that he has woven these incommensurates, Christian interior virtues with fantastic dragon-slaying sword play. It's a sword epic. You could make a fantastic film for the kids, an arcade game out of Beowulf. And at the same time, exactly at the same time, it teaches all of the mystical values of interiorized space patiently being developed. But what's peculiar is that the structure of Beowulf is such that Beowulf, as a hero, must slay two monsters, a pair of monsters. He not only has to slay the monster, but the monster's mother. Because every monster has a mother who's even worse. You thought that you had it tough slaying the monster. Wait till you find his mother. And in Beowulf, there's 50 years in between. 50 years. In Hellenistic Judaism, that was a jubilee. 7 weeks of Sabbaths. It was 50 years. And so Beowulf has a golden age for one jubilee, And that jubilee is held in its form of sacredness by the parentheses of having to deal with Grendel, the hell fiend, and the mother of the hell fiend. So at the beginning of his golden reign, he has to slay Grendel, and at the end, he has to slay Grendel's mother. And of course, in slaying Grendel's mother, he himself dies. Just as in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Gawain has to face a pair of trials. He has to face the Green Knight, and then in the second trial, he has to face the Green Knight in his own place. It's one thing to face the Green Knight where you cut off his head in your place, Arthur's castle. It's a totally other thing to have to go to his castle where he's going to cut off your head. That's equivalent to Grendel's mother. The structure between Beowolf and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is a resonant structure by someone who knew the English language, wisdom, epic tradition perfectly. We're talking about perfectly. There are people who know these kinds of things. Gunslingers who are sent in to clean up when things get out of hand. What was the old saying? There's no law west of the Brazos, and there's no God west of the Pecos. When things get that bad, then you have to send in a gunslinger. The author of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight understood that the English language came in originally with Beowulf, full-fledged wisdom tradition, and understood that if you're going to have a renaissance, you have to, first of all, brighten the language with a radiant epic. And so Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is the radiant Middle English epic that makes the language available for the renovation of human character and values that you find in Chaucer and the other authors there in the English language in the late 14th century. It's a fantastic age. It's an unbelievable age. And it's an age which is not at all primitive when you recognize that some 100 years before Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, you had people like Roger Bacon and Robert Grosseteste making Oxford University one of the great scientific and logical sites in the world at that time. Tremendous development. Experimental science happened only in the England of those 1200s. It was one of the great places. So that Scottish tutors from England went to the continent and became the magicians and wizards for all the continental geniuses at that time. Friedrich Hohenstoffen's Magus advisor was Michael the Scot. And Michael the Scot is the first to ever wear the conical wizard's hat with the stars and the crescent moon on it and the long robe that we see as the image of Merlin. It's the cosmic hermit. And yes, Michael the Scot's costume was modeled on the Persian Magus, the ancient Persian Magus. But that becomes the symbolic archetype which we see on Merlin. Walt Disney's Merlin is dressed in the costume of Michael the Scot. He's not at all dressed like 5th century AD. He's dressed like 13th century archetype, seeing underneath that that's really what was there, really what was true. In a way, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is related to Beowulf. They have a very similar kind of a thing. Whereas in Beowulf, the final trial is not with Grendel, but Grendel's mother. The final trial in Sir Gawain in the Green Knight is not so much with the Green Knight, but with the wife of the Green Knight in his castle. And the difference is between the mother and the wife. That the 650 years separating Beowolf and Sir Gawain in the Green Knight is a development where the difficulty in the first was with the mother, the second is the difficulty was with the wife. It is a profound difference. Because the feminine, in terms of a mother, is one kind of a matrix. One even can see that in the word matrix, one has the root for mater. The mother is a matrix, whereas the wife is a very powerful vector, an arrow that takes all of the distributed energy of the matrix and shoots it one way. Gawain is the object of the arrow of all of the energy of the wife. She's the wife of the Green Knight, and she is seeking to seduce Sir Gawain. And to the extent that he falls for that, he dies. But it's not simplistic. If it were simplistic, it would be in terms of the mother's value. Did he sleep with her? It's not that at all. It's extremely refined, because the whole point of the chivalric code is that love is what is sacrosanct. Not virginity, love. And the poignancy and power of respecting the spirit of love was the code in chivalry. From the mother's standpoint, it's virginity. From the standpoint of the mature woman, it's, is my love respected? And the chivalric code was that when she makes an offer to herself in her own place, it is a desecration of the spirit of love to refuse her. So Gawain is caught in a double paradox. One paradox just simply in terms of mother ethics, the other an even worse paradox in terms of that he is a knight, a chivalric knight, all based upon his respect of love, and he is in peril of desecrating that. And we find out what happened next week, unless you go and buy your own copy and you cheat and read it.